Hey everyone, welcome back and thanks for your time. Hurricane Milton passed north of the Space Coast this past week, and normal activities at the Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Space Force Station were suspended throughout. Only minor damage was reported, and both were reopened late on Friday, so they were more fortunate than areas closer to where the storm made landfall. In this video, I'll go through how Milton and that involuntary week off impacted Artemis operations in Florida and near-term estimates. I was able to get more details from Boeing about how core stage production was going, and I'll see how those pieces fit into the puzzle. And the Starship Flight Test 5 schedule changed. It is expected any day now, not in late November. But as it affects Artemis, we're looking ahead to the IFT post-flight, which is realistically the earliest that SpaceX or NASA might provide an update on the forward outlook and the 2025 schedule. The big story of the week was Hurricane Milton, which crossed the Florida peninsula overnight October 9th to October 10th. Weather modeling seemed to converge through the day on Saturday, October 5th, that the storm would strengthen significantly, and the track was expected to cross the Gulf of Mexico and then move across central Florida. Although rapid intensification was expected, the storm still seemed to exceed those expectations, peaking in strength on Monday, October 7th, well above the Category 5 threshold on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. Kennedy Space Center was effectively closed for most of the week, with its HURCON status steadily decreasing to the most serious level as the storm approached. The storm was disrupted by dry air and wind shear before it made landfall, and the Space Coast ended up on the dry side of the storm as the center of circulation moved across the state and then out over the Atlantic on the morning of October 10th. The status and position of Artemis hardware is often a newsmaker from month to month or week to week, and there's a significant amount of Artemis flight and ground hardware at Kennedy Space Center or Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. With the exception of the Orion stage adapter that connects Orion and SLS, all the Artemis II hardware is there. Most of the SLS hardware is in or around the vehicle assembly building, and the Artemis II Orion spacecraft is in the operations and checkout building in the KSC industrial area just south of Launch Complex 39. Exploration Ground Systems had just rolled Mobile Launcher 1 off Launch Pad 39B and inside VAB High Bay 3 at the end of last week, and Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs posted some additional imagery of that move during the week. A few shots were posted showing Crawler Transporter 2 rolling out of the high bay on October 4th after it lowered the mobile launcher to hard down on the pedestals there. You can see the pedestals and also how close the ML base is to the VAB doors. KSC Public Affairs also posted a couple of shots of ML1 taken from the Mobile Launcher 2 construction site, the East Park site on the north side of the crawler way that surrounds the VAB. One shot was taken underneath the platform, and one was taken up on top on the ML2 deck. Even though this specific storm had not developed when the rollback occurred last week, the fact that the Atlantic hurricane season continues was likely a part of the considerations about the timing of the rollback. The Space Coast has also recently seen late-season storms. But there's also critical EGS, Orion, and SLS hardware for Artemis III and IV at Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Both SLS interim cryogenic propulsion stages for Artemis II and III are still being kept for NASA by United Launch Alliance at their Delta Operations Center in Cape Canaveral. And as noted, Mobile Launcher 2 construction was in progress at the East Park site. And the Orion spacecraft and SLS Core Stage engine sections for Artemis III and IV are also at KSC, either in production or soon to be in production at facilities there. But probably not so much this past week. With the Space Center and Space Force Station closed during most of the week, work on most of that hardware was suspended during that time. The schedule impact from the storm will depend on how much cleanup is necessary on-site, but also cleanup for the workforce off-site has to be a consideration. Some of the things we were talking about last week, like Artemis II stacking preparations for Mobile Launcher 1, probably lost a few days of schedule. We'll see if there are any reported adjustments, but the big picture watch items are still likely bigger schedule drivers. Later in the day on October 10th, Kennedy Space Center posted on social media that the initial assessment from the ride-out team that stayed on site through the storm was only minor damage. Late in the afternoon on Friday, October 11th, the Space Center reopened. Hurricane Milton had weakened to Category 1 strength at the close approach of the center of circulation, but given that the Mobile Launcher 2 work site was outside, we'll see if that is specifically noted at some point. In other news, there were increasing signs during the week that the Starship Flight Test 5 target date was closer to now than to late November, despite previous statements. SpaceX posted a pre-flight preview on Monday, October 7th, confirming that they were making plans for a launch on Sunday, October 13th. Eyes turned to the Federal Aviation Administration again, and there was a noticeable change in their response this time to Adrian Beale, who covers this for NSF. No mention of late November anymore, and during the week there were additional signs that a launch attempt on the 13th was possible. Ultimately, for Artemis, the question right now is when there will be more clarity on the future outlook and schedule for Starship development and testing. SpaceX is confident they will be able to successfully perform a return-to-launch site recovery of the Super Heavy booster, but there is little clarity about when orbital flight tests will begin or when the on-orbit Artemis tech demonstrations will happen. Maybe a successful test will prompt SpaceX or NASA to share more details about the schedule for the first orbital flight test and a roadmap beyond that, but they could share that before the test or even regardless of the results of the test. All eyes will be on Starship when it lifts off on IFT-5 to see what happens. It's post-flight after IFT-5 when we might hear something new about Starship HLS. SLS Core Stage prime contractor Boeing also provided updates on a few of my questions this past week. A month ago, the engine section boat tail for Core Stage 3, which is assigned to Artemis III, arrived at Kennedy Space Center and was set up in the Space Systems Processing Facility, where the engine section itself is being outfitted. We last saw those in pictures taken on September 10th as they were being prepared for stacking. The boat tail attaches to the bottom of the engine section barrel. Boeing said that the engine section to boat tail bolting is essentially complete. Next up would be orbital tube welding and wire harness integration. Via Boeing Communications, the integrated production team also said that a couple of hardware installation milestones are also complete. The 4 thrust vector control or TVC platforms and the 5 large helium bottles have been installed inside the engine section. Both are parts of the main propulsion system. The TVC platforms sit on top of the thrust structure, and the 5 gaseous helium composite overwrapped pressure vessels attached to the inside wall of the barrel. The TVC platforms are part of the stage's hydraulics, with much of the equipment for one hydraulic system on each platform. The helium COPVs are part of the MPS pneumatics. They support both MPS and RS-25 engine operations for things like engine purges and valve actuation. The equipment that needs to be installed in the engine section requires a lot of choreography, especially given the large amount of equipment that fits into a small volume inside. Most of the engine section volume is consumed by the aft dome of the liquid hydrogen tank. All this equipment being installed now, for the most part, fits underneath that. Another large hardware set to be installed are the 2 liquid oxygen Y ducts. Those are a part of the liquid oxygen feed lines that start at the aft dome of the liquid oxygen tank up at the top of the stage. 2 large diameter lines run from the LOX tank sump up there, snake out of the inner tank, and run on the exterior of the stage, down the length of the liquid hydrogen tank. The 2 lines then enter the engine section. Those 2 segments have already been installed on the Artemis III/Core Stage 3 engine section, supported by these aft reaction structure beams. The LOX feed lines then have these Y ducts that fork the 2 lines into 4 slightly smaller diameter feed lines that match up with the RS-25 engine liquid oxygen low-pressure turbopumps, which is the engine LOX inlet. The pre-valve for each feed line is also at that Y duct junction. Boeing said that those Y duct installations are now planned for early next year. Moving to the other major subassembly, production of the upper 4/5 of the stage continues at the Michoud assembly facility in New Orleans, and Boeing says that the forward join of the upper 3 elements, the forward skirt, liquid oxygen tank, and inner tank, is now projected next summer, the summer of 2025. So putting that together, it still sounds like it might be possible to ship the 4/5 to KSC for final assembly by the end of 2025. The liquid hydrogen tank is the other element, but that is ahead of the forward join for this 3rd build. So in theory, Boeing could have that ready for the subsequent major join relatively quickly after all the forward join integration is completed. For more detail on that, I went over the outlines of core stage production in a couple of videos earlier this year. I put a link to the second part that covers this later phase of production up in the corner. Boeing will be working final assembly in the VAB in Florida for the first time, which might make things a little slower, but between that and the time they forecast will be saved, it seems like Boeing is within shouting distance of having Core Stage 3 complete and ready to hand over to EGS in 2026. That's probably too late to support a September 2026 target date for Artemis III, but that's probably the case for all the other programs for different reasons. It at least still seems possible for SLS to support another launch by the end of 2026. But it's also possible that the Artemis schedule will be changed again, and the Artemis II and Artemis III dates will be delayed a little bit, which will give all the programs a little more time, or maybe a lot more time, to finish their hardware. NASA wants all the contractors to keep working towards their existing delivery dates. The sooner they have a good idea about what hardware is available when, the more options it may give them for use. Sticking with the Core Stage production notes from Boeing, I asked about the disposition of the Core Stage 5 build, which would be pointed at Artemis 5. Boeing Communications said that NASA has given them essentially the authority to proceed with what I'd call major production of Core Stage 5. NASA has in the past noted that some of the structural rings for the stage have already been fabricated, but those are not long lead parts. What I asked about was beginning assembly of the engine section structure, which would be the barrel panels and the I-beams for the thrust structure. And Boeing says that so-called authority to proceed was given by NASA to them to start this month, which also happens to be the first month of fiscal year 2025, possibly more than just a coincidence. Artemis 5 isn't going to launch until the middle of 2030 at the very earliest, and that delay was due to a worsening budget situation. If one of the Artemis III alternative mission concepts is to be believed, though, then that might accelerate the need for the 4th and 5th core stage units. A core stage build at a very high level was described as a 16-month period of materials procurement and receipt, followed by 36 months of production. That is still the concept of operations, with 3 builds in production simultaneously. If Boeing were able to reach that 36-month timeframe for the 5th build, then in theory this stage would be available for use by NASA and Artemis by the beginning of 2028. But it's speculation whether or not NASA would need either a 4th or 5th unit that soon. Given the uncertainties with each of the programs about their future outlook and schedule, we're still waiting for an updated forecast from NASA on the schedules for Artemis missions the rest of the decade. So, with work at Kennedy Space Center mostly suspended for the week due to Hurricane Milton, here's where things stand with Artemis II and Artemis III ahead of a big NASA decision for Artemis II and just ahead of the next Starship flight test. Kennedy Space Center was closed for most of the week, so work was likely suspended on the Artemis II Orion spacecraft ahead of another round of vacuum tests in the altitude chamber. Work would have also been suspended on stacking preps for Mobile Launcher 1 in the VAB. That might shift the timeframes for the vacuum testing and for readiness to stack by a few days to a week. So maybe Mobile Launcher 1 readiness for stacking is closer to the beginning of November now than the end of this month. For Artemis III, we've gotten a little bit of guidance, so to speak, on the outlook for the Orion and SLS builds for that. Still waiting for that announcement on the Orion heat shield decision, and that will directly affect both Artemis II and III, but if it's still possible to assemble and test a new base heat shield unit in parallel with Orion crew module integration, then it may be possible that the Artemis III Orion and SLS hardware could support a launch in the late 2026, early 2027 timeframe. For Starship and the Axiom lunar surface spacesuits, we'll have to see when there's an update on their outlook for 2025. With respect to Artemis III, Starship is progressing towards the Earth orbit propellant transfer demo, and Axiom is progressing towards the critical design review for the EVA suits. But we haven't received an update on how much progress since the beginning of the year. Thanks as always for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. The next episode on Artemis III alternatives might have to wait a little bit. I submitted a set of questions about Orion and SLS to NASA at the end of September, and it often takes a little while to get an official response or statement. In the meantime, we'll see how KSC is doing the week after the hurricane. As I record this, the Starship IFT-5 test was still aiming for tomorrow, Sunday, October 13th, and NSF has probably already started its continuous coverage of that. After the test is completed, we'll be very interested to see whether SpaceX or NASA are ready to reveal anything new about the HLS schedule.